Welcome to the second lecture on the history of medical and health-related research and the birth of research ethics. As you may recall, in the first lecture this week, I addressed the tension that exists between the epistemological or scientific objectives of doing research, that is, to generate new, original, relevant, useful, and beneficial knowledge, versus the ethical objectives of doing research, that is, to protect the interests and well-being of each individual research subject. I also addressed several research scandals and forms of medical crimes having been committed in the 20th century, and I draw attention to how these crimes and scandals have influenced the shaping and development of ethical guidelines, ethical rules of play for doing research. In today's lecture, I will continue to reflect on the history of medical and health-related research. I will address 3 additional research scandals and look into how these scandals had a direct influence on the way different ethical codes, ethical guidelines have been shaped. I will end today's lecture by drawing attention to the importance of grounding ethical guidelines in medical and health-related research in fundamental human rights. So let's move now to our lecture. This is the second lecture this week on core events in the history of medical and health-related research ethics and the birth of research ethics. In the first lecture, we focused on the following core events and research crimes and scandals: the Nuremberg trial and the medical crimes that caused the trial, the Nuremberg Code, the Tuskegee syphilis study, the hepatitis studies at Willowbrook State School, Staten Island in New York, the cancer injection study at the Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital in Brooklyn, New York. Today we are going to address 3 additional medical crimes and research scandals. First, the atrocities and medical crimes committed by Japanese physicians with war prisoners during World War II. Second, the Guatemalan sibling scandal, which involved US medical researchers who intentionally gave a group of Guatemalans gonorrhea and syphilis to study the disease in vivo. And finally, the Swedish dental research scandal, the so-called Vipeholm study. Let's then take a look at the medical crimes committed during Second World War in Japan. And it's based on a paper published by Howard Brody and colleagues in 2014. And I quote from this paper: in 1945 to 46, representatives of the US government made similar discoveries in both Germany and Japan, unearthing evidence of unethical experiments on human beings that could be viewed as war crimes. The outcomes in the 2 defeated nations, however, were strikingly different. In Germany, the United States played a key role in bringing Nazi physicians to trial and publicizing their misdeeds. In Japan, the United States played an equally key role in concealing information about the biological warfare experiments and in securing immunity from prosecution for the perpetrators. The greater force of appeals to national security and wartime exigency helped to explain these different outcomes. End of quote. And Brody and colleagues continue. It is informative to compare the American response in Japan with the work of one important figure in Germany, Canadian Air Force officer John W. Thomson. Thomson recognized the German experiments as war crimes that set a dangerous precedent for the scientific community and was uniquely influential in persuading Allied authorities to act. End of quote. A database at Oxford Brookes University has identified approximately 25,000 victims of German experiments, with confirming documentation for around 10,000. But only about 5% of experiments ended with the death of the subjects, but many others caused severe mutilation. Let's then move to Japan. Unit 731, which was located near Harbin in Japanese-occupied Manchuria, comprised 3,000 personnel, 150 buildings, and the capacity for holding 600 prisoners at a time for experimental use. Thousands of human beings were experimented on and killed at Unit 731 alone. Additional thousands were killed in other branches of Japan's extensive biological and chemical warfare program. The Unit 731 experiments involved deliberately infecting prisoners, primarily Chinese prisoners of war and civilians, with infectious agents and exposing prisoners to bombs designed to penetrate the skin with infectious particles. There were no known survivors of these experiments. Those who did not die from infection were killed to be studied at autopsy, and in the waning days of the war, all remaining prisoners were killed to conceal evidence. This is, from a legal perspective, a very important difference between the situation in Germany and in Japan. In Germany, there were several thousand survivors of these horrible experiments, and they could act as witnesses during the Nuremberg trial. While the Japanese authorities, before they surrendered, they killed everybody who had not died directly from the horrendous experiments. And for this reason, there were no core witness that could be used in a trial. Japanese military units also carried out field testing of disease-spreading weapons against both enemy troops and civilian populations. Additional thousands of deaths were caused by spreading plague-infected fleas and cholera bacilli in China in this manner. The Nazis justified their experiments on three grounds: racist beliefs, eugenics, public health concerns, and wartime national interest. Two of these justifications motivated the Japanese. They viewed the Chinese and Koreans as racially inferior. They also appealed frequently to patriotism. They were not, however, concerned about threats to Japanese racial purity. Rather, they simply wished to eliminate inferior populations and occupy their territories for Japanese imperialist expansion. The Japanese also argued that the prisoners used as experimental subjects as suspected resistors and communists would have been executed in any event. The Japanese scientists were more astute than the Germans, both in banding together to plan their American investigations and in realizing that the American interest in their data gave them a powerful bargaining chip. The final reports by US scientists stated, "Such information could not be obtained in our own laboratories because of scruples attached to human experimentation." And then listen what is further said. It is hoped that the individuals who voluntarily contributed this information will be spared embarrassment because of it, and that every effort will be taken to prevent this information from falling into other hands. The ethical reasoning implicit in this passage seemed to be the following. US scientists have scruples regarding experimentation on humans. The Japanese scientists had no such scruples, indicating that their activities were unethical, if not criminal. Second, Having conducted unethical and criminal experiments, the Japanese scientists are therefore in a position to be embarrassed by the revelation. Third, saving the Japanese scientists who belatedly cooperated with the US inquiry from embarrassment is a higher ethical priority than securing accountability for war crimes. And finally, the overriding goals are first to secure these unique, because they are unscrupulous, data for the United States, and second, to prevent them from falling into other, that is, communist hands. Here you see a blatant form of double morality by the US authorities. They played a noble role during the Nuremberg trial in Germany after the Second World War. But at the same time, although they discovered medical crimes against humanity on an even higher scale than that had happened during the Second World War in Germany, in spite of the fact that the horrendous experiments committed by Japanese authorities during the same war were in many ways even worse, the US authorities decided the results of these scrupulous experiments are of such an important scientific value for us, because many of these horrendous experiments were experiments of relevance for biological warfare. They negotiated with the new authorities in Japan and with some of the researchers that had committed these crimes to get access to the results. And in fact, several of these war criminals, these medical researchers in Japan, they got a new career in US laboratories after the Second World War. A horrible example of double morality. Then the Guatemala study, which was a study similar to the Tuskegee syphilis study we talked about in the first lecture. And again, this was led by the United States public health authorities and was conducted in Guatemala from 1946 to 48. The experiments were led by a physician who had also participated in the later stages of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment in Alabama in the US, Dr. John Charles Cutler. They infected soldiers, prostitutes, prisoners, and mental patients with syphilis and other sexually transmitted diseases, and for sure, without asking the informed consent of the subjects. These experiments resulted in 83 deaths, and serology studies continued through 1953, involving the same vulnerable populations, in addition to children from state-run schools and orphanage and rural towns, though the intentional infection of patients ended with the original study. So we see here this thing that repeated itself again and again. The experiments were conducted on extremely vulnerable individuals. On October 1st, 2010, the US President Barack Obama, Secretary of State and Secretary of Health and Human Services, formally apologized to Guatemala for the ethical violations that took place. Guatemala condemned the experiments as a crime against humanity, and a lawsuit has been filed. Just to illustrate the horror that was committed during this study, the case of Berta. Berta was a female patient in the psychiatric hospital. In February 1948, she was injected in her left arm with syphilis. A month later, she developed scabies, that is an itchy skin infection caused by a mite. Several weeks later, Dr. Cutler noted that she had also developed red bumps where he had injected her arm, lesions on her arms and legs, and her skin was beginning to waste away from her body. Berta was not treated for syphilis until 3 months after her injection. Soon after, on August 23, Dr. Cutler wrote that Berta appeared as if she was going to die, but he did not specify why. That same day, he put gonorrheal pus from another male subject into both of Berta's eyes, as well as in her urethra and rectum. He also reinfected her with syphilis. Several days later, Berta's eyes were filled with pus from the gonorrhea, and she was bleeding from her urethra. 3 days later, on August 27th, Berta died. The study was discovered by a female US historian, Susan Mokotov-Reverby, and she discovered this in the files of the US Health Ministry while researching the Tuskegee syphilis study, and she shared her findings with United States government officials. In October 2010, the US government formally apologized and announced that the violation of human rights in that medical research was still to be condemned, regardless of how much time had passed. And following the apology, Barack Obama requested an investigation to be conducted by the Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues. The commission concluded its research 9 months later and concluded that the experiments, I quote, involve gross violations of ethics as judged against both the standards of today and the researchers' own understanding at the time the study was conducted. In April 2015, 774 plaintiffs launched a lawsuit against Johns Hopkins University, the pharmaceutical company Bristol Myers Squibb, and the Rockefeller Foundation, seeking $1 billion for damages. The hope was that the compensation could be attained by targeting private institutions rather than the federal government. That is, the Johns Hopkins University, this pharmaceutical giant, and the Rockefeller Foundation. In January 2019, US District Judge Theodore Chuang rejected the defendant's argument that the recent Supreme Court decision shielding foreign corporations from lawsuits in US courts over human rights abuses abroad also apply to domestic corporations absent congressional authorization, and decided to admit the trial. So this trial is still ongoing, but we don't know yet the outcome of the trial. Let's then move to Sweden and the Vipeholm study. The Vipeholm study or experiments were a series of human experiments where patients of Vipeholm Mental Hospital in Lund, Sweden, were fed large amounts of sweets to provoke dental caries, that is, the decay of the teeth. It was conducted in the period of 1945 to 1955, that is, after the discovery of the horrendous medical crimes that had been committed during the Second World War in Nazi Germany and in Japan. The experiments were sponsored both by the sugar industry and the dentist community in an effort to determine whether sugar affected the formation of cavities. The experiments provided extensive knowledge about dental health and resulted in enough empirical data to link the intake of sugar to dental caries. Some details about the Vipeholm study. The picture to the left is of one of the victims of this study. Most of the individuals that were included in the study were people with Down syndrome. To the left, to the right, you see the pictures of what happened with their teeth. Vipeholm was the country's largest facility for what was called in that period uneducable retards, and was chosen to be the site of the largest experiment ever run on humans in Sweden at that time. What began in 1945 as government-sanctioned vitamin trials were converted in 1947 without the knowledge of the government. The researchers decided, in consultation with the medical board, to start to use sugar instead to encourage tooth decay by using an extremely sweet and sticky diet. From 1947 to 49, a group of mental patients were used as subjects in a full-scale experiment designed to bring about tooth decay. They were fed copious amounts of candy, which resulted in many of them having their teeth completely ruined. Nonetheless, the researchers felt that, scientifically speaking, the experiment was a huge success. By then, the teeth of about 50 of the 660 subjects in the experiment had been completely ruined. The sugar industry donated huge sums of money and tons of chocolates and caramels to fund the experiments because the industry was not pleased with the results, and the researchers delayed their publication. When the study was finally made public in 1953, a critical debate arose about why they had been held back for so long. The scientists were accused of having been bought by the industry. However, at the time, there was not any public debate about the ethics of the experiments themselves. Not at all a debate about the 660 individuals with Down syndrome who had been included in the study and whose teeth had been destroyed as a result of this experiment. In the first lecture this week, I mentioned this constant tension between the epistemological or scientific aims of doing research and the ethical objectives of doing research, and that there is a constant tension between these two objectives. This study, the Vipeholm study, for example, was the first scientific study that established a causal relation between sugar and dental caries. So scientifically speaking, it was a very important study. So the scientific objective was realized. But the way the study was conducted violated all ethical rules of play of doing research. Let me then move to some afterthoughts about the history of research ethics in the 20th century. And I quote first from a prominent US bioethicist, Arthur Caplan. In a small paper he wrote in 2010, just after the disclosure of the scandalous study that had been conducted in Guatemala, horrific medical tests of past raise concerns for today. As more research moves outside US, are we still exploiting the poor? We want to believe that doctors are treating the poor, vulnerable, and those outside the US with more care and respect. But are they? Have we really learned what we should have from the travesty of past medical experiments? Three very important questions. I will come back to those. Since 1996, the global community of research policymakers, researchers, and bioethicists have been aware of the so-called 1090 gap in medical and health-related research. This metaphor was introduced to depict the monstrous inequity in the world with respect to whose diseases are favored in ongoing or planned research programs. In concrete terms, this means that at least 90% of the economical resources spent annually on medical and health-related research are targeting the health needs of the richest 10% of the world's population, something which implies that the needs of 90% of the world's populations have to be met from the remaining 10% research funding. Furthermore, figures from recent empirical studies give reason to believe that the 1090 gap has not diminished, although during the last 15 years, the number of people from poor and low-income countries enrolled in clinical trials has substantially increased. On the contrary, evidence from these studies suggests that during this trial period, the relative availability of new drugs to populations in poor and low-income countries has not increased, while the gap between wealthy nations and poor and low-income countries with regard to who benefits from the advances of clinical research and development continues to widen. We are now living through a pandemic, that is, a disease that is affecting all inhabitants of the global village. But we see now also the enormous discrepancy when it comes to which countries in the world are benefiting from the development and production of the vaccines against COVID-19. Again, we see the 1090 gap in practice. This situation, I believe, makes it justifiable to claim that international research today is not only carried out in a global climate of gross background injustice, but a concerted action of powerful stakeholders in the affluent parts of the world. International research contributes in itself actively to maintaining this injustice instead of reducing it. For these reasons, I believe that the answers to Kaplan's pertinent questions have to be answered in negative. Part of the responsibility for this exploitative situation, I believe, falls on the shoulders of the community of bioethicists, which silently has accepted that international guidelines in medical research ethics have become more and more diluted so as to serve the interests of the most powerful stakeholders in the field. That is the international pharmaceutical industry, National Institute of Health in the US, and the European community. The crimes committed by medical doctors in Nazi Germany and in Japanese concentration camps during the Second World War took place within tyrannic political systems. The medical crimes against humanity today are the product of political decisions made by democratic states in the most affluent part of the world. As a bioethicist living and working in a democratic country in the most affluent part of the world, I feel utterly shamed. Back to history, back to the Nuremberg Code, to the creation of the World Medical Association, and to the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. These initiatives form together a basis for a new international order with regard to research involving human beings. The birth of research ethics, so to speak, is a birth that came as a necessary result of horrible crimes that had been conducted in the name of medicine. The Nuremberg Code, that was the normative code that was drafted and crafted after as one result of the Nuremberg trials. The reception of this code was not very enthusiastic. It was a normative framework aimed at protecting the rights and well-being of subjects undergoing biomedical research. It was widely perceived as a code to mark out barbarian doctors and not as a guide intended to be followed by responsible, the so-called good doctors, and it had little impact on the medical communities, especially as far as research practices were concerned. The code was the perception was addressed to medical criminals, not to good physicians. It was not until the 1970s that the procedural measure of voluntary consent, first articulated in the code, was seriously taken into account. In the 90s, 50s, and the 1960s, some articles in medical journals emphasized the importance of relying on a normative framework for research involving human beings, but the code did not seem to have any direct influence on the conduct of medical research. The boundary between correct and incorrect research behavior was still perceived as up to the ethical consciousness of individual researchers to determine. And the practices were ruled by an internal research code based on the model of moral neutrality, or the so-called scientific purity of science. Then let's move to another important core event, the Declaration of Helsinki of the World Medical Association. And we are now in 1964. This declaration also became a subject of first debate in professional medical journals. It was viewed by many physicians as an intrusion on the moral consciousness of the individual researchers, and it was viewed as an attempt to enforce upon them compulsory behavior. But then, two of the research scandals I was talking about in the first lecture this week speeded up the work on normative guidelines. The Jewish chronic disease study in 1964 and the research scandal at Willowbrook State School in New York in the period of 1963 to 1966. As a result of these two scandals, the National Institute of Health in the US set up a commission to review issues concerning involvement of human beings in medical experimentation. And two core messages of high importance in this report. First, in a situation in which a patient is involved in a research project, the sole judgment of the investigator is not a sufficient basis to reach a decision concerning the moral issues raised by the researcher-patient relation. Second, the researcher's consciousness is not the most suitable instance to assess the ethical aspects of a biomedical experiment. This led to the creation of the so-called Belmont Report. The Belmont Report was issued by the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research, and it was published in 1974. This report dismissed the rules suggested in previous ethics guidelines as the Nuremberg Code or the first version of the Declaration of Helsinki as being too general and therefore inadequate as a normative basis for biomedical research. And three basic ethical principles was proposed: the principles of respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. The Belmont Report, in a way, represents the American way of thinking about research ethics. That is, it reflects the Anglo-American liberal tradition, especially its emphasis on the notion of individual autonomy. The report was promptly adopted and backed by the American Medical Association and other medical organizations in the US. Its influence is also evident in declarations and guidelines that emerged later. For example, the International Ethical Guidelines for Biomedical Research Involving Human Subjects, issued by the International Council of Medical Sciences. In one or in several of the lessons you are obliged to read, we provide a detailed analysis of these SIMS guidelines that were revised in 2002, in 2008, and latest in 2016. Let's then take a look at the American versus the European way when it comes to drafting and crafting of ethical guidelines. While in the USA, the emergence of a code of conduct for medical researchers was strongly influenced by a liberal, pragmatic tradition that embraced the principlist approach, in Europe, the Nuremberg Code and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights gave rise to an approach based on human rights. This human rights-based approach is clearly traceable also in the conflictive story of the Declaration of Helsinki, which has undergone several revisions, the last revision in 2013. Let's then take a brief look at some differences between the Declaration of Helsinki and the Nuremberg Code. First, the Declaration of Helsinki was crafted, the original version was crafted by 3 physicians, a Danish physician, a Norwegian physician, and a Finnish physician. In the Declaration of Helsinki, an explicit distinction is made between clinical research combined with professional care involving sick persons and clinical research carried out on healthy subjects for the advancement of scientific knowledge. Just a brief correction of myself. The third member behind the first version of the Declaration of Helsinki was not Finnish. He was Swedish. The declaration got its name from the capital of Finland, where the first version of the declaration was published in 1964. The irony is that the Finnish Medical Association rejected the declaration, but in spite of that, the declaration has kept its Finnish name. There were some loopholes in the first version of the Declaration of Helsinki. For example, no mention was made of peer review or a system of ethics committees. Still, there was the belief that the individual researcher, him or herself, was entitled to evaluate the ethical aspects of a research project. Second, the welfare and safety of the involved research subjects were still considered to be the full responsibility of the individual investigator. Then came the 1975 version of the Declaration of Helsinki, and in some way the most important revision, because in this version of the Declaration of Helsinki, it is put emphasis on the need to assess research protocols not by the individual researchers themselves, but by an independent ethics committee. Second, a move from voluntary consent in the Nuremberg Code to informed consent in the 75 version of the Declaration of Helsinki. With the revision in 1975, it seemed that biomedical research involving human beings finally had been furnished with a firm system of internationally accepted norms and principles. But then, in 1997, a first controversy broke out. Until that time, there had been international consensus in medical and health-related research that the use of placebo, that is, to give one group of research subjects sugar pills while the intervention group was given the drug under investigation, could be accepted if no established treatment existed yet. But then in 1997, some powerful stakeholders insisted on changing this and accepting that one could use placebo as a comparative alternative to so-called standard of care or established effective treatment if the trials were conducted in poor and low-income countries where such treatment did not yet exist. And the controversy broke out in relation to several studies to find out whether the HIV viruses infected the fetuses of pregnant women. And this controversy was around the question, is it ethically justifiable to operate with lower moral standards when conducting clinical research in poor and low-income countries than when the same studies are conducted in the affluent parts of the world? Because still, it is the case that in no affluent countries is it permitted to use placebo in a randomized clinical trial if there exists an established effective treatment. Then the control group should receive this treatment, and and the intervention group should then receive the drug under trial. So why this difference? Why is it justifiable to conduct such studies not using standard of care in poor countries, while it is not permitted or justified in rich countries? This debate had a direct impact on the further development of the Declaration of Helsinki, in the sense that some of its strongest commitments with regard to protecting the interests and welfare of individual research participants and vulnerable communities came under first pressure from different voices that represented research and policy institutions in the USA and Europe and the international pharmaceutical industry. For these reasons, the Declaration of Helsinki underwent in 2002 and 2008 new substantial revisions to try to accommodate the interests of these powerful voices and facilitate the conduct of clinical trials in poor and low-income countries. The double standard controversy is about the facilitation of the use of placebo, the dilution of the requirements of care in such situations, and reduction of sponsors' post-trial responsibilities towards research participants and host communities. The reaction to these revisions and to this dilution of the requirements with regard to using placebo, the reaction was from two different sides. The FDA, that is the drug regulator in the US, played a crucial role in watering down both the restrictions on the use of placebo in the declaration and the post-trial access requirements. And because of the down-watering did not go so far as FDA wanted, they decided in 2008 to stop referring to the Declaration of Helsinki in their guidelines. The other redirection came from a group of bioethicists in Latin America, and this group issued the Declaration of Córdoba, which stated that the 2008 version of the Declaration of Helsinki is ethically untenable, is contrary to the idea of human dignity and human and social rights, is offending people's integrity, and is injuring the Declaration of Helsinki's own notion of justice. So what was then, let's first take the first critics of the 2008 version, that the FDA in the US, who said the revision did not go far enough, and for this reason they rejected to refer any longer to the Declaration of Helsinki. They proposed instead the so-called good clinical practice guidelines, a system for clinical trials that was developed by the International Conference on Harmonization of Technical Requirements for Registration of Pharmaceuticals for Human Use, a horrible name. So who is behind these good clinical practice guidelines? Yes, behind are drug regulators from the US, the European Union, and Japan, as well as representatives of the pharmaceutical industry in the US, Europe, and Japan. There are 3 observers, the WHO, the European Free Trade Association, and Health Canada, as well as the International Federation of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers and Associations. Obviously, a group of the governmental agencies and industry groups of the world's wealthiest countries. So what did the group of Latin American bioethicists propose instead of the 2008 version of the Declaration of Helsinki? They referred to the Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights, which I was talking about during the second lecture in week 1. And as you recall, behind this Universal Declaration that was adopted in 2005 on October 7th, behind this declaration is not medical associations in some countries, but all the 190 member states of the United Nations. This declaration has been firstly criticized, in particular by bioethicists and policymakers and regulators from the United States. And the critique goes as this. First, lack of academic quality of the experts that had participated in the drafting of the declaration. This is a flat lie. Critique of the human rights-based approach in the declaration as more of an ideology than ethics, and critique of some of the principles of the declaration as being useless, for example, the core principles of dignity and vulnerability. And also, we see from the same group of ethicists a tendency or an active tendency to deny or disclose, hide the existence of the Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights. For example, Ruth McLean, who is a very prominent US, New York-based bioethicist, in her book, Ethics in Global Health, Research, Policy and Practice, there is no reference whatsoever to the Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights. That is the only existing normative declaration that links bioethics and human rights, and the only existing declaration that has 192 member states behind itself. The second book, the Oxford Textbook of Clinical Research Ethics, no mentioning whatsoever of the Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights. I am now rounding up this lecture. And which values and principles should then guide the practice of medical and health-related research? First and foremost, what I call the normative bedrock of medical and health-related research. That is the priority of the individual principle, which is beautifully stated in Article 3.2 of the Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights. The interests and welfare of the individual should have priority over the sole interest of science or society. And other core principles are informed consent, the principles of benefit and harm, and the principle of human vulnerability. In the 2013 version of the Declaration of Helsinki, the primacy of the individual principle has been retained and reads thus, I quote, "While the primary purpose of medical research is to generate new knowledge, this goal can never take precedence over the rights and interests of individual research subjects." Looking at the SIMS guidelines, on the other hand, in the 2016 version of the SIMS guidelines, the primacy of the individual principle has been downwatered even more than in the 2008 version by emphasizing the scientific and social value of research, and notably already in Guideline 1. And I quote, "The ethical justification for undertaking health-related research involving humans is its scientific and social value, the prospect of generating the knowledge, and the means necessary to protect and promote people's health." If we take into account how research ethics was born in the ruins of World War II and the discovery of horrible medical crimes that had been conducted, then it is understandable why the primacy of the individual principle became so central, that the interest and well-being of the individual research subject should always have priority over the interest of science and society. Unfortunately, although other parts of the Declaration of Helsinki has been watered down, for example, this double moral standard when it comes to the use of placebo, fortunately, also in the last version of the Declaration of Helsinki, the primacy of the individual principle has been retained. But we see that in another very influential guidelines, the SIMES guidelines, the last version, as the 2008 version, has turned this principle upside down, indicating that the scientific and social value can be given priority to the interest and well-being of the individual research subjects. And that is a scary development. So to my concluding remarks. I started my first lecture this week by quoting a passage from the preface of a work of Joachim Bach on the importance of historical understanding. And I will end this lecture in a similar way. We study history not only to understand our past. Without knowing the past, we will not be able to understand the present. Thank you. So to my concluding remarks. I started the first lecture this week by quoting a passage from Joachim Bach's great work on the history of hermeneutics in the 19th century. In this passage, he is emphasizing the importance of historical understanding. I will end this lecture in a similar way by drawing attention to the importance of history, not only in order to understand the past, but also in order to understand and navigate in the present. What I hope I have achieved during these two lectures is to make you understand how important it is when reading and trying to interpret different ethical guidelines to know about the history of these different guidelines, to know what has caused the different developments of these guidelines. To read a text that is used today, it is important to take into considerations its context, that is, its history. Thank you for your attention.